The officer who responded to the 911 call arrived to find a retired man standing beside his own swimming pool holding a padlock. His pool, his yard, his padlock. Elias Vance had simply decided to close his private pool for the season. The pool he had built himself 12 years ago. The pool his grandchildren had learned to swim in. The pool that sat entirely within the deeded boundaries of his property. He hadn't asked permission. He didn't need to. But Brenda Sterling had called 911 anyway. And while the officer was explaining to her that closing a private pool was not a crime, Elias had already found something that absolutely was. But what Brenda didn't know was that closing that pool was never the plan. Finding what was underneath it was. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you love HOA revenge stories, hit subscribe to Karen Conflict. You don't want to miss what comes next. Elias Vance was 64 years old, recently divorced, and a retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years designing drainage systems for the county of Whitfield, Alabama. When his marriage ended, quietly and without drama, two people who had grown into different lives, he kept the house. Not out of stubbornness, but because the house had the pool. And the pool had been his project from the first shovel in the ground. He'd designed the drainage himself, poured half the decking himself, installed the filtration system himself. It was the one thing in his life that worked exactly the way he had planned. He'd been living in Whitefield Glen HOA for 14 years and never once received a violation notice until Brenda Sterling became president. Brenda arrived in the role the way certain people arrive in positions of power, as if the position had been waiting specifically for her. 50 years old, blazer pressed regardless of the temperature. Reading glasses on a lanyard she never actually used for reading. A printed copy of the community guidelines that she carried the way a priest carries scripture. She introduced herself to Elias at a community meeting and immediately noted that his pool enclosure fence might not meet the updated aesthetic guidelines the new board had adopted. Elias checked the guidelines. His fence predated the amendment by 11 years. Okay, he was grandfathered. Brenda smiled and said she would look into it. She looked into it, and then she began looking into everything else. The first violation notice arrived the week after the community meeting. $54 pool equipment visible from the street, a pump housing Elias had installed in the side yard that had been there, unchanged, for 9 years. He responded in writing, cited the installation date, attached the original permit, and mailed it certified. The fine stood. He paid it, made copies, and told himself that new administrators sometimes needed time to find their footing. He was being generous. He should have known better. By month 3, the notices were arriving in pairs. A citation for the color of his pool deck chairs, deemed non-compliant with community color palette standards, under an amendment adopted 4 months earlier that Elias had never been notified of. A fine for the towel hooks mounted to his fence, classified as exterior hardware requiring board approval. A warning about the pool lighting, visible after 9 p.m. Described as a community nuisance, despite the fact that his yard was fully fenced and the lights faced inward. Elias filed a formal dispute with the HOA board, citing procedural failures in amendment notification and the selective application of new standards to pre-existing installations. The board acknowledged receipt. 2 months passed. No hearing was scheduled. He called the county property office, was told HOA disputes were civil matters outside their scope. He consulted a property attorney who confirmed he had legitimate grounds to challenge, but warned that HOA litigation in Alabama moved at its own pace, 18 months minimum, outcome uncertain. That was when his neighbor, Richard, stepped in. Richard was 69. A retired county assessor who'd lived 3 houses down for 17 years, and had watched Brenda conduct a similar campaign against a young couple who'd moved in 2 years earlier. They'd received 14 notices in 5 months and sold within the year. Richard had noticed a pattern no one else had named. Every targeted homeowner had, at some point, questioned Brenda's authority at a public meeting. Elias had done exactly that. politely, with documentation, at the very meeting where Brenda had first mentioned his fence. Richard had kept a timeline. He presented it one evening over Elias's back fence with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for the right person to give it to. Elias filed a second complaint with the state HOA regulatory board, citing Richard's documentation, received an acknowledgement. Nothing for 3 months. Then Brenda moved to the pool itself. She filed a formal HOA action, claiming that Elias's pool, because it was visible from the HOA common walking trail, through a gap in the perimeter vegetation, constituted a shared community amenity and was therefore subject to HOA usage regulations and mandatory safety inspections. The claim had no legal basis that Elias could find in any document, but it arrived on official HOA letterhead filed with the county clerk's office, which meant it was now a matter of public record that would follow the property title. Elias read the filing 3 times. Then he called Richard. Then he called his attorney. Then he decided he was going to close the pool for the season, not because Brenda had won. Because closing the pool meant draining it, and draining it meant exposing the drainage infrastructure beneath. And Elias had been a drainage engineer for 30 years. He had noticed something in the HOA stormwater records 6 weeks earlier that he hadn't mentioned to anyone. He wanted to see it in person before he said a word. Elias drained the pool on a Saturday morning in October. The process took most of the day. By mid-afternoon, the water level had dropped enough to expose the drainage channels along the pool's eastern wall. Channels. Elias had engineered himself connected to the property's private drainage easement running parallel to the LAS community's stormwater line that ran along the shared property boundary. What he found when the water cleared confirmed what the county records had suggested. The HOA's community stormwater pipe, the one Brenda had overseen the installation of 18 months earlier as a community infrastructure improvement, had been tapped. A secondary line, clearly added after the original installation, ran directly from the HOA pipe into Elias's private drainage easement. Not adjacent to it, into it, using Elias's private infrastructure to handle overflow from the HOA system. Without his knowledge, without an easement agreement, without any compensation, and without any permit that Elias could find in the county records. His pool drainage had been subsidizing the HOA's stormwater system for over a year. Elias documented everything. Photographs, measurements, the junction point, the secondary pipe, the absence of any recorded easement. He called his attorney that evening. His attorney called the county engineering office on Monday morning. Brenda, apparently sensing that something had shifted, organized what she described as a community infrastructure walk, a Saturday morning event where she led interested residents along the walking trail to review community improvement projects. 40 residents attended. 'Twas the kind of event Brenda organized when she wanted an audience. She should have chosen a different morning. Elias's attorney and a county engineering inspector arrived at the property boundary at the same time. As Brenda's walking tour, the inspector confirmed on-site in front of 40 residents that an unpermitted secondary pipe connection existed between the HOA stormwater system and Elias's private drainage easement. Brenda attempted to explain that the connection had been part of a community drainage improvement approved by the board. The inspector asked for the permit. Brenda said the board had handled it. The inspector noted that no permit had been filed with the county. Brenda said there must be an administrative error. Then Brenda made the mistake that finished her. Flustered, residents gathering closer, she turned to the inspector and said that the drainage arrangement had been necessary because Elias's pool had been identified as an unauthorized discharge point affecting community stormwater management, which was why the board had exercised its infrastructure authority to address it directly. She had just told a county inspector and 40 witnesses that the HOA had intentionally connected to Elias's private drainage system based on a claim they had never disclosed to him, using authority that did not exist. The inspector wrote it all down. Elias said nothing. He had spent 30 years designing drainage systems for the county of Whitfield. He recognized when the water had found its level. The county engineering office filed a violation notice against the HOA within 2 weeks. Unpermitted infrastructure connection, unauthorized use of a private easement, failure to obtain required permits for stormwater modification. The fine was not $50. It was $4,200 per month until remediation. Richard submitted his 17-year timeline to the state HOA regulatory board the same week. Elise's attorney filed a civil complaint citing the easement violation, the documented pattern of targeted enforcement, and the false claim Brenda had made in front of a county inspector. The HOA's insurance carrier contacted the board within 10 days. The phrase willful infrastructure trespass appeared in their letter. The phrase personal officer liability appeared directly after it. Brenda Sterling resigned from the HOA presidency 14 days after the walking tour. She did not give a reason. The board accepted her resignation at an emergency session by a vote of 5-0. One board member who had been present on the walking tour submitted a written statement saying she had not known about the pipe connection and had been told by Brenda that all permits were in order. Elias's property title was cleared of the HOA's spurious pool claim within 60 days. The secondary pipe connection was removed at the HOA's expense, an independent engineering firm, not one recommended by Brenda, completed the remediation and certified Eliza's drainage system restored to its original permitted state. The pool reopened the following spring. Eliza's grandchildren came down for Memorial Day weekend. He watched them in the water from the deck chair the HOA had once cited for being the wrong shade of tan. He had no regrets. He hadn't set a trap. He had simply drained his pool on a Saturday morning exactly the way a retired engineer drains a pool, which is to say, carefully, with attention to what the drainage reveals. Here's what I want to know. Leave it in the comments. If you discovered that the system targeting you had been quietly stealing from you the whole time, would you have stayed as calm as Elias did? If you enjoyed watching karma work, smash that like button and subscribe to Care and Conflict. I post new HOA revenge stories every week. Comment below, have you ever dealt with a Karen like this?